It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. We're continuing our discussion with the author and scholar Norman Finkelstein about the 50th anniversary of the 1967 war. Norman, let's get to the American context and the American Jewish context. A key argument that you've made in your work is that Israel did not factor very much into American Jewish life until '67, which I think would surprise many people. What changed then? What happened? Why did Israel all of a sudden become an important issue for American Jews?
Well, there's a Hungarian philosopher, a Marxist philosopher. He's, of course, passed the scene a long time ago. His name was Lukács, and he once commented that it's important always to see the present as history, to see the present in a historical context. And that remark always resonated with me when I was studying the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict and also writing, to some extent, not largely, on the Nazi Holocaust and its reception in the United States. The fact of the matter is, Israel figured very marginally in American Jewish life up until 1967. I, for example, at one point went through the main Jewish periodicals during the period from Israel's founding until 1967, and there's barely anything on Israel. If you take the main socialist Jewish periodical, it wasn't really Jewish, but socialist with Jewish editors, Dissent magazine, and people like Irving Howe, who were very prominent American Jewish intellectuals, who later became fanatically pro-Israel. Between 49 and 60, Dissent was founded in 54. Between 54 and 67, there were only 3 articles on Israel in Dissent. And of those 3, one of them condemned Israel for the 1956 invasion of Egypt, the Sinai attack. You take the most mainstream Jewish periodical, the establishment periodical, it was Commentary magazine. There was a famous joke by Woody Allen: what do you get if you combine dissent with commentary? You get dysentery. But you have to be from that era to appreciate it. So Commentary is edited by this person named Norman Podhoretz. Beginning in 1960, Podhoretz comes to the helm of Commentary. Podhoretz also became a fanatical pro-Israel supporter after '67. So now he's editor-in-chief of Commentary in 1960. It's very interesting. I read through all the issues from '60 to '67. There's barely any mention of Israel. Once in a while you'd have an article like, my son had a bar mitzvah in Israel. These kind of human interest stories, but very little having to do with the politics of Israel.
There was a connection, though, during this time between the American left, the American Jewish left in Israel. I mean, it's personified by Noam Chomsky, who went and lived there with his wife, right?
Yeah, well, Professor Chomsky back then was not a known leftist. He only came to prominence in the early '60s with the
Those
Vietnam
who were
War.
socialists.
Yeah,
American
people on the
socialists.
leftist end of the spectrum. And that brings us to the point of why the people on the leftist end of the spectrum were not afraid of the dual loyalty charge, because they did have a second loyalty to the Soviet Union. That was part of their political being. So the idea of a dual loyalty did not scare the American Jewish left, because they already had a dual loyalty. But those who wanted to be in the mainstream of American life, which the Communist Party obviously wasn't, the biggest fear that Jews have always had is this charge of a dual loyalty, that they're not really loyal to their state where they have citizenship. They're loyal to this entity, namely international Jews, this conspiracy of international Jews. So there was always among Jews the fear of being tagged as having a dual loyalty to your state, but also to international Jewry. Come Israel's founding in 1948, there's a real problem now, because there's an institutional basis for the claim of dual loyalty. Israel claims to be the state of the Jews. So American Jews now have a big burden. The burden is, here is a state that's saying that we claim your loyalty and you should be loyal to us. This is after World War II, where for reasons which haven't been clearly analyzed yet, suddenly all the doors are opening up to Jews. It was a period of incredible upward mobility among American Jewry. And as this upward mobility suddenly seems a real prospect, the very last thing American Jews want is to be tagged as having a dual loyalty to Israel. So they're keeping Israel at arm's length because, number one, they don't want the charge of dual loyalty in general, but number two is because they're now on the verge of making it in American society.
What changes then with the '67 war?
Well, the main thing that changes is that now Israel becomes integrated with U.S. power. The U.S. starts calling Israel its strategic asset because Israel had proved itself a first-class fighting force in the '67 war.
And struck a blow to Arab nationalism by
knocked out Nasser, knocked out radical Arab nationalism, finished it off, which the U.S. wanted to finish off also. It wasn't just Dayan and Ben-Gurion. The U.S. also wanted to knock out this pest named Nasser. And so now what happens is suddenly Israelis are heroes in the United States. They are, as the word had it, they are fighters. Now you have to remember, this is the era where the U.S. is suffering serious setbacks in Vietnam. And our own fighting force is not very, or appears not to be very impressive. And now
also being beaten by a third world
Right, also
army.
being beaten by these third world anti-imperialists, so on and so forth. And so now Israel appears to be beating back the third world anti-imperialist hordes in the Middle East. They're winning wars while the U.S. is losing a war. In fact, at that time it was said, what we need to do, meaning the United States, we have to bring Moshe Dayan to Vietnam. Yeah, that's what was said at that time. And he will show us how to win the war. And he did go in 1966, my memory is, but I could be wrong. My memory says 66, but I could be mistaken. In any case, so now the tables had turned, whereas before, if you were pro-Israel, it resurrected the charge of dual loyalty. Now, if you were pro-Israel, you were super loyal to the United States because Israel was defending our interests in the Middle East and it was winning. So now it was safe to be pro-Israel because Israel was our strategic asset.
And not just safe, but advantageous. And I want to quote you something that you write. You're talking about neocon Zionists. And you write, these gung-ho Zionists did not even subscribe to the Zionist tenet that Jews had no future in the Gentile world. On the contrary, they converted to Zionism because it facilitated their acceptance in the United States.
Yes, because now if you were pro-Israel, you were a hero in the United States because Israel was defending our interests and winning. So it was a cachet to be pro-Israel after '67. And then there were all sorts of fringe benefits. One of the fringe benefits, which is completely forgotten now because culture has changed so radically, The image of Jews back then, Jews were nebishi, if you can translate that from the Yiddish.
Woody Allen.
Yeah, Jews were nerdy. Jews were schlemiels. Well, that's what we were described as back then. Jews were weaklings. Mm-hmm. And that's the overall cultural stereotype, the Woody Allen type, the scrawny Jew with the horn-rimmed glasses. And then super added to that was the image of Jews from the Nazi Holocaust.
The sheep to the slaughter.
Yeah, because back then it was said, it's so funny to say it now because people will just look at me like I'm dropped from another planet. Back then, it was a very big embarrassment to be a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. My parents, as you know, were both in the Nazi Holocaust. My father was in Auschwitz, my mother was in Majdanek. Every member of their family was exterminated on both sides. And my mother always used to get very angry when people asked her the question, how did you survive? Now, you might think that's an innocent question, and in fact, most of the time, I think it was meant innocently, but there was always the subtle dig, or my mother perceived it as such, that the only way you could have survived is if you did something dirty.
You collaborated.
You had to have done something. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, how did you survive? Mm-hmm. And I remember sometimes people would ask that question to my mother innocently, and she would get indignant. She'd say, what a dirty question, you know? But the other thing was, those who didn't survive, they went like sheep to slaughter. It was a badge of shame to have survived. Israel tried to rework, I hate the word, but I'll use it now, tried to rework the narrative. So they started to call it, when it came to the Nazi Holocaust and commemorations, they didn't call it Day of Remembrance. They called it the Day of Resistance and Remembrance, because they conjured this whole mythology that there was massive Jewish resistance to the Nazi Holocaust.
Well, where they could, there was.
There wasn't.
Where they could.
We have to be honest, there wasn't. If the Russian Red Army barely defeated the Nazis, some Jews rounded up in the ghetto when they're ground down from years of hunger and destruction, the idea of resistance. One of the reasons Raoul Hilberg, the famed historian of the Nazi Holocaust,
he wrote The Destruction of the European Jews.
Yes, yeah. He was reviled by the Holocaust industry, is because he kept saying there was no resistance.
And when you say Holocaust industry, just to clarify for people, you're saying those who exploit the memory of the Holocaust.
Yes, and also create all sorts of mythologies. And he was a meticulous historian who had no ideological axe to grind. He really was one of those rare persons who was just interested in the facts, ma'am, just the facts, as they used to say in Dragnet. There was no resistance. There couldn't be.
Exactly.
There couldn't be. But the Zionists wanted to create the image of the Jewish fighter. Mm-hmm. Well, to fast forward, after 1967, Jews now had a new image, something totally new in, so to speak, Jewish history, the image of the Jewish fighter. And American Jews grabbed it. They loved it. They loved it. There was actually a quite good book written probably around 30 years ago now by Paul Brines. He's a professor. He's probably passed the scene already. It's called Tough Jews. And he talks about how after 1967, all of a sudden you start seeing this proliferation of novels by Jews about Jews who are blonde-haired and blue-eyed and muscular.
Yeah.
You know, it was totally unheard of before. Blonde-haired Jews, blue-eyed Jews, muscular Jews.
I don't know too many blonde-haired Jews.
And the Jews, American Jewry, they really grabbed at it, the idea of the fighter.
And this is a really typical case of sort of the macho dynamic. This inflated artificial sense of toughness and manhood is achieved through projection onto an act that really is beating up on defenseless people. The Arabs in '67, as you documented in part one, didn't put up much of a fight, and of course the Palestinians under occupation that Israelis rule over also don't have a military.
Well, it's a very strange dynamic. I'm not too fond of psychohistory, but there is a kind of psychological dimension to it, which has a lot of relevance even to this audience, because that was the era in which real tensions came to the surface between the Jewish and the African American community. Right at the time of the '67 war is the 1968 school strike in New York, pitting the largely Jewish teachers union headed by Albert Schenker against the African American community in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. And there was now a lot of tension between African Americans and Jews. And even when you read Norman Podhoritz's memoir, The Making It, he talks about how he was always afraid of being beaten up by African Americans. And a lot of this psychodrama being played out in the United States, beating up Arabs, was a displacement of the tensions with African Americans in the United States between African Americans and Jews. It's a weird dynamic.
Is that why then in like the 80s and 90s and maybe even the 2000s, I would read about, people like mainstream Jewish figures complaining about black anti-Semitism as if that was a serious problem?
Well, it's a bit of a digression, but it's still, I think, worthy of comment because the history has been so completely rewritten. When we talk about that era, the only people they talk to you about are Schwerner and Goodman, Rabbi Heschel, and of course, they deserve any kind of recognition they get. And there is a but. One has to be honest about what it was like in the American Jewish community back then. I grew up in it. I didn't know a non-Jew up until I entered college. No, that's literally true. These were very ethnic, homogeneous enclaves. Now, my school had non-Jews, Madison High School. You'd never know it because it was so internally segregated. It was all the honor, what were called back then honor and honor bright classes, were all Jewish, without exception. All right, there were two exceptions. In any event, getting back to the point, the Jewish community was so racist. And now, in retrospect, it's kind of mind-boggling. But nobody ever, except in my family, nobody ever referred to black people as Negroes, which was the proper term back then. It was always niggers, coloreds, and Schwarzes. Niggers, coloreds, and yes, that was the Jewish community. Now, it's all been forgotten. They talked about in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the black anti-Semitism. But what's completely left out was the Jewish racism, which was so thick in the Jewish community. That was my neighborhood. That's what it was like. And so all of the hatred, loathing, animus towards African Americans was now, after '67, displaced on Arabs. Very strange phenomenon. Nobody's ever commented on it, but you had to have experienced it to see what was happening. Just as an interesting point, after Israel wins in '67, so the Arabs are now humiliated, Six-Day War, as it was called, wiped out all the Arab armies. And the claim was that the Arabs no longer have what was called back then a war option, because Arabs, this is what was said then, the Arabs don't know how to fight. And you know what they called the Arabs? Israelis called them, the nickname. They were called monkeys. And that's why the 73 war came as such a shock to Israel, because they had internalized all the racism. Arabs can't fight. So they didn't believe that the Arabs can mount an attack on Israel. It was the racism.
Okay, so which takes us then to what's going to be our next part, part 3. We're going to talk about what changed for the world in '67 and what has happened in the 50 years since of occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. My guest is Norman Finkelstein.